It is a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to have all of you attending this lecture from wide ranges of the globe. Thank you, Dr. Yamasaki, for being part of this. I'm very excited. I mean, I use your work in my thesis, and it'll be really awesome to have a discussion about this at the end. So, yes, I'm here in Cyprus. Greetings from Cyprus. I'll be leaving to the Netherlands in, yeah, T-minus like 7 hours. So, I'm really excited for my final thing for the time being on the island to be this lecture. So today we're going to be talking about one of the dearest maritime artifacts to my heart, and that is an anchor. But before we get into that, I want to, set the stage as you do in a good discussion, in a good lecture. And I'm not going to assume that every one of you knows exactly where we are. I mean, this is a maritime archaeology series, but people have wide ranges of maritime archaeological expertise. And so let's just kind of set the stage a little bit. I mean, I'm working in Cyprus. This is the focus of my research for my master's and also continuing to my PhD. This is where we are. We're in the Eastern Mediterranean. Amazing. Now, specifically, I don't want you to assume that all of you know all of the archaeological history data around the island. And so let's do a little sort of precursor before I really dive into what I want to focus on tonight. And so first, let's really discuss where we're looking. So my work focuses on one city, basically, in Cyprus, the city, the ancient city of Kition. Now, you see up here I wrote Kition Area II or Cathari, and that is because Kition, unfortunately, lies underneath the modern city of Larnaca here in Cyprus, which means excavation work was kind of divided between different sort of smaller sectors or areas of Kition because that's how the city sort of dictated the work that was done in the 20th century and continuing today. And so one part of Kition, Area 2, is what my work focuses on. This is a so-called religious or sacred complex, and this is where the anchors that I'm going to be analyzing and discussing for you today basically all originate from. Now, you can see on the map here, I have a map of Cyprus. This red arrow points to roughly where Kition and Larnaca is. And this is a nice aerial photo of Kition Area 2. You can see these monumental stone buildings. We're going to see a lot of floor plans. We're going to see a lot of different angles of this, but this just to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about, what we're looking at here. Now, as I mentioned, these sites are underneath modern Larnaca, and you can see here a nice aerial photo of modern Larnaca, and I have highlighted on this map two of the excavation sections of Kition. That purple circle is Kition Area 2, what we're going to talk about today. The green circle is another really important sort of subsection excavation center point of Kition, and that's Kition Area 4 or Kition Bambula. And this section of Kition is currently still being excavated very well by the French team. I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but some of the archaeological work there does inform understanding of Kition Cathari or Area 2. And I really wanted to highlight these two sections because as you see, they're not anywhere near the water or the sea. You can see we've got on the right there basically a little bit of the modern harbor, the modern port, but there's no water anywhere near archaeological sites. And that's a bit of an issue for us because this is a maritime talk. I'm talking about a maritime artifact, and yet we don't have water. Fear not. You can see here we have a very nice blue line that I have painstakingly digitized in GIS on top of this map. And that blue line roughly follows coring data that's been done by different teams over the past 20 or so years, which showed that the ancient coastline was actually 400 or 500 meters to, well, basically on this picture to the left, than it was that in antiquity than it is today. So basically, Kition was built and established on the seafront, on the water. That enabled it to be this really important port center. And then over time, we see a lot of geomorphological changes. There's a siltation of the coastline. And so that gives us modern Larnaca, where the sea is a lot further away. So when I'm talking about anchors in a port and water, you can kind of get a picture and understand what it would have been like in the Bronze Age. And here, this is a digital elevation model that I created of the coastline of near Larnaca. That black square is roughly where Kition Area 2 would be. And this is roughly what the elevations would have been in antiquity. And the blue is zero elevation or the sea. So we get another sort of picture of what the coastline was like a couple thousand years ago. At the bottom left corner there, you can see sort of this little inlet, and that's actually what today are the salt lakes that are enclosed off from the water. But also in antiquity, there was another important port center, Palas placed actually directly on this open area. Now, the site of Kition, Area 2, I'm just going to refer to it as Kition for most of this lecture. And if I have a different section of Kition I'll specify, was very well excavated and published. It was published throughout primarily the 80s by Kariorghis and Demas. And for the focus of this lecture, I wanted to give you a bit of the chronology of the floor layers because I'm going to be using that for analyzing and understanding the utility of these anchors in a ritual manner. Now, fear not, I don't need you to memorize any or all of these tables. I wanted to illustrate the fact we have a published chronology from the 80s, and we also have a slightly revised version by Smith given in 2009. I primarily focus on Kariorghis and Demas's chronology. Smith believes that there is sort of continuous occupation at Kition, which isn't necessarily the case, but I wanted you to have those, both there to understand what we're looking at. And we're mainly going to be focusing on floors 3 through floor 1. Highlighted there in that circle, that's where the majority of our material comes from. Now, as I mentioned, Kition in general was first built in 1300. And when Area 2 was established, this religious or sacred complex, there were two main structures there. Temple 3, the small temple highlighted here, and Temple 2, a slightly larger, mildly monumental structure. Now, this area was in use for roughly 100 years, and then at the start of the 12th century, there was a massive reconstruction phase that occurred at Kition. And so that smaller Temple 3 was demolished and covered over by an open-air temenos and a couple of rooms. Temple 2 remained in use, and it was actually enlarged, and a bunch of new structures and areas were built in this temple area. And this is really important because this is when we're actually going to be focusing primarily on. This is when most of our material comes from. So just to give you a bit more of an understanding of this area, here we have that Temple 2 that's been enlarged. It's still being used 1300s onward. And then we also have twin temples 4 and 5 being constructed at the same time in the 12th century. The large monumental Temple 1, constructed of ashlar and masonry, was first built in 1190 as well, along with two open-air temenoi. And not necessarily a monumental building, but we have the northern workshops first being built and used in the 12th century. And I'm highlighting these as well because we have anchors in ritually significant positions coming from all of these spaces. We also have Western textile workshops at Kition, but there are no significant anchors coming from these workshops, and so I'm not actually going to really talk about that at all today. Now, I've used the term temple a little bit, and before I dive further into our understanding of rituality here at Kition, I really want to define this term a little bit. Now, when I say temple, I'm not talking about these beautiful classical structures that we might see in Greece. You hear temple, you might think of the Parthenon, you might think of the Temple of Zeus at Olympus, Temple at Delphi. There's lots of beautiful buildings that are temples, but those are a very different type of building than the ones we have in the Late Bronze Age in Kition. When I'm talking about temples, I'm talking about large monumental structures. They may have some industrial functions as well. We have archaeological materials which indicate metallurgical working was going on, not just in those northern workshops, but also in some of these buildings, along with textile production and potentially other industrial activities. But all of these things were quite tightly interwoven with ritual and religious activities in the Late Bronze Age. And so when I talk about temples, I'm really talking about a large monumental building that has some level of ritual importance. Now, I'm looking at the maritime element in this rituality. And Area 2 is very interesting because we have a couple different examples of maritime rituality. We have beautiful schematic ships carved on the south wall of Temple 1, which you see there on the left, and in the center here we have the drawings of that and a picture that I took when I was there in the spring. And then on the right there, we see an altar from Temple 4, and on this altar there are two or three ship graffiti carved on the side. The bottom there is a photogrammetric construction by Dr. Manolova that I assisted on. And then there's this more schematic drawing you see up there provided by Smith. So we have a really important example of maritime rituality that aren't anchors in Kition. We also have a large collection of shells originating in Temple 2. About 84 come from floors 3, floors actually 4 a little bit earlier in the 1300s, 1200s, 13th century, and a little bit later as well. About until the 10th century, we've got shells kind of collected in different floor layers in Temple 2. And then, of course, We have the anchors. That's what this lecture's on. So these are the most important example and collection of maritime ritually significant artifacts in Kition. And so that's why I wanted to really hone in and focus on them. But we have sort of a long trajectory of maritime rituality at the site in general. Now, before I get all the way into understanding how these anchors were used at Kition and how I interpret them in a ritual manner, I really want to give a little bit of background on stone anchors in general, because I don't expect all of you to know necessarily what a stone anchor is or what they look like or how they were used. So let's dive into that slightly. Up here on the screen, besides my little anchor you're going to see in the left corner at every slide, this is one of the anchors that's displayed in the Larnaca District Museum, coming from Kition. I have two images, and these are a little bit later than the period we're looking at. They come from the Iron Age in Cyprus. They're 8th century. They're from white painted trifoil jugs. The left one is in the Cyprus Museum, and the right one is in the British Museum. And these are important examples because they're the only two examples of ships with anchors in a Cypriot context. Even though they're later, I wanted to include them. And they have been used for understanding anchors in a ritual manner. We can talk about maybe at the end of this lecture. But I just wanted to kind of give you a bit of a visual example of how anchors are sort of depicted in, well, the Iron Age, but in Cyprus in the Eastern Mediterranean, near the period I'm looking at. Okay, so anchors in the Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean, not just in Cyprus, are made out of stone. They're not these metal objects that we have today on a ship that people tattoo on themselves. However, they function primarily the same way. They're gonna be used to stop a ship. They're really important for seafarers in the Bronze Age because if you encounter a storm, you don't have all of the technological advancements we do today. You don't have motors, you don't have electricity. So you really basically need to drop anchor and pray and hopefully find maybe a sheltered anchorage area if you can. So these anchors were one of the most important, if not the most important tool of a seafarer in antiquity. Now, I keep saying stone anchors. These anchors indeed were made of stone. Most of the time, they're made of limestone or sandstone. There are exceptions, but that's the main rule. And predominantly, stone anchors in the Eastern Mediterranean are either triangular or trapezoidal in shape. Now, there are two main types of anchors, which we find in Cyprus and around the Mediterranean during this period. And that is a weight anchor, which you see there on the left. Weight anchors have a single piercing through which you would string basically the rope to allow it to attach to, most of the time, the bow of a ship. And also we have a composite anchor, and composite anchors have two additional holes. What are those for? Well, they would be used to shove two pieces of wood, a stake or a fluke, and potentially the utility of this was allowing an anchor to basically catch in the sandy sea floor when it was being dragged and dropped to sort of perform its job better. So it didn't just rely on its weight, it also was able to snag on the sea floor. Now, there may be another reason for the differentiation between a composite anchor and a weight anchor. And I want to thank Dr. Batruba for this. I use this primarily in one main section of my thesis, and you're here today, so that's really exciting. I hope you like this, and I look forward to talking at the end. But basically, composite anchors maybe were used because they were a technological advancement. But looking at a summary of all the anchors around the Mediterranean, we might have another explanation. And that is potentially Cyprus acts as the birthplace and the main place of origin for this type of anchor. Now, I have up here one of my favorite paintings. I wanted an excuse to use it, The Birth of Venus by Botticelli. And that's because Cyprus is traditionally associated with the Greek goddess, much later, but bear with me, Aphrodite, and it's connected to her birthplace, or at least the first place that she stepped on land in mythology. And in a similar manner, Cyprus may be the birthplace of the composite anchor. Now, why do we think this? Well, if we survey all of the shipwreck evidence of anchors underwater with a shipwreck, if an assemblage of anchors occurs with more than two specimens all the time, those are weight anchors. So they're not the composite anchors that we're looking at. And interestingly enough, we find weight anchors in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond from the third millennium down into the first millennium. So for a very long period of time. Whereas when we have composite anchors in a securely dated position, it's between the 13th, 15th, excuse me, and the 12th century. which means if this was like a technological advancement, you might have expected one anchor to die out, or at least the more quote unquote advanced anchor to take the place of the other one, or at least be used simultaneously, which isn't the case, at least with the surveyed material we have. And if we look a little bit further, we find that most composite anchors come from Cyprus and or associated with Cyprus. So we might find an anchor in the Palestinian-Israeli area with a Cyprominoan sign. A Cyprominoan is a script we have in Cyprus in the Late Bronze Age. Unfortunately, we don't know what it says yet, but it does indicate a clear connection to the island. And so we see a specimen outside of Cyprus with connections to Cyprus. We also have in Karnak in Egypt, an anchor which is almost identical in shape, a composite anchor, to an anchor from Halasutenzeke, an important Cypriot site, as I've already mentioned. We do have some exceptions to this rule. For example, we have like a large amount of composite anchors, 8 coming from Komos and Crete, and there's one composite anchor in Point Iria. But overall, these do point, at least to some extent, to composite anchors originating and being connected with Cyprus. And there's some interesting ramifications of this when we actually look at their ritual use at Kition, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, I've talked about anchors underwater, but the ones that I'm looking at in my work and in this lecture all come from a terrestrial context, the sacred district area of Kition Kathari in Cyprus. They're not underwater. And there are actually 3 really important sites around the Eastern Mediterranean with large collections of anchors. Kition, Byblos, which is in modern-day Lebanon and was a major city in ancient Canaan or associated with the Canaanites and later the Phoenicians, however we define that term, or we could just say associated with the Biblians. And then also there's a large amount of anchors coming from Ugarit or Ras Shamra, which is located in modern-day Syria. Okay, amazing. Let's delve into this slightly more before we go specifically to focus on Kition. Now at Byblos, we have 28 anchors that have been cataloged and documented primarily by the pioneering maritime archaeologist Honor Frost. If you're in this presentation, you probably have heard of her, and she's really important because she was the first person to understand these pierced stones were actually anchors, both underwater and on land. Now here we have a beautiful picture of a really large weight anchor lying against the sacred courtyard of the Temple of the Obelisks at Byblos. And we also have a large collection of anchors here. You see, they were actually used as a step for the Tower Temple at Byblos. Why that's important and what that might tell us, we'll come back to, but you get the idea. We have a lot of anchors at Byblos, and importantly, they're almost all within religious or sacred contexts. They come from an enclosure, the Tower Temple and the Temple of the Obelisk, all connected to some sort of ritual activity. The same thing occurs at Ugarit. We have a lot more anchors than Byblos. We have 42 coming from Ugarit, and most of them cluster in the Temple of Baal, excuse me, an important storm deity for the Canaanites and later the Phoenicians, which is important for seafarers. We'll come back to this. And most of the time, the anchors we see at Ugarit are these Ugaritic type anchors. And finally, we have a lot of anchors at Kition. As I mentioned, I'm not going to talk about that right here because we're going to talk about them as nauseum in a second. But we also do have anchors coming from other Cypriot sites, and I just wanted to sort of do a precursor for that. This picture you see here is an aerial image of the Carpathia, the sort of little tail of Cyprus, and there are a lot of anchors and anchorages found off the coast of Carpathia, including at Cape Andreas. We also have a decent, actually, amount of anchors at Halasutenzeke, this port center, dated to the Late Bronze Age, only used in the Late Bronze Age, and very near Kition. But an important difference between the anchors there and the ones that I'm looking at is they're never in a ritual context. They're always just incorporated into buildings, regular buildings, not religious structures. And then we do have 2 anchors coming from Ankumi, maybe another 6 that are really badly documented, unfortunately. No pictures mentioned in like one note. So if anyone who was working at Ankumi, hi Eddie, could tell me more about those anchors if they see it in the material they're working with, would love that. Okay, finally, let's just talk about the general potential sacred associations of anchors in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age in the Mediterranean, and then we're going to really hone in on Kition. Now, we see anchors, as I've already kind of touched upon, being used as offerings. They're placed in important places, for example, temples, as we'll talk about, also in tombs, connecting a mortuary sphere to a seafaring maritime ritual sphere. And I have up there the Argonautica. So basically, in this text, it's much later. Okay, it's the sort of second half of the first millennium. But in this text, Jason of the Argonauts, a hero. I despise this man. The only good action that I think he's ever committed is placing an anchor at a well as an offering. And basically, anchors would be found at wells not just in text, but also in reality, because a well is an important place for a seafarer. Two, a well is a place you get your fresh water for those long voyages at sea. Now, anchors are also used as betyls, basically an aniconic focal point of worship. So these could have been used instead of like a humanoid idol, especially when they're in an upright placement position. And we're going to be talking about this a lot as well. And then, in addition to the religious structures I've already mentioned, we do find anchors built in or used at or near religious structures around the Mediterranean. Egypt, Bahrain, other places of Greece. In the Iron Age, we do find some anchors at Amathus, which is an important Iron Age city in Cyprus. And there's many other sanctuaries, both Greek and Roman, that have anchors, but never in large quantities like these three sites I've mentioned. And finally, when anchors have marks, for example, this is a Cypriot mark you see here on this drawing. It's the Cypriot arrow mark. When they have marks or cupules, which are cut cup holes in stone, and these occur in anchors in the Mediterranean, in other stone objects in the Mediterranean, and actually in other stone objects beyond, in Scandinavia, we see this as well. If we take those marks and cupules and combine them with certain ritually significant positions, it can give us an even more illuminating picture of how these objects were used. Now, some people have asked about interpreting the anchors at Kition and other sites, but I'm going to talk specifically about Kition as maybe not anchors, but as weights. And I want to briefly mention this and sort of refute this idea. A weight, for example, a weight for an olive press, is predominantly going to have a different shape than an anchor. They're going to have slightly more rounded bottoms so they can sit and stand upright more easily and be more easily functional when they're used with their associated machinery. As well, as I've already mentioned, Kition is placed in antiquity directly on the water. And so if we're trying to vacillate, are they weights, are they anchors? The more logical conclusion is they are anchors just because of their proximity to water. Obviously, that's not enough to say anything definitive, but these two things together already give us a better understanding of them as anchors, not just a generic weight not used at sea. And finally, these composite anchors I've talked about already, you would not make a weight for an olive press or any other type of artifact in a composite shape. There is no reason to do this. You might have a shape reminiscent of a weight anchor used for other type of weights and machinery, but you wouldn't have a composite anchor or a composite weight because those were specifically to be used at sea or at least represent the type of artifact being used at sea. And so I think we can pretty confidently conclude that we're not looking at a general weight when we see the mass collection of artifacts at Kition. Okay, let's really dive into a bit of what I did and then the ramifications of that work. So I wanted to briefly give you an overview of my methodology to kind of give you food for thought. I'd love to have discussions about what I've done, and so you can also understand the conclusions that I've drawn. Now, basically, Kition, the anchors from Kition Area II were published by Carriorgus and Demas, but then they were put into a wonderful catalog by Honor Frost, and she counted 147 specimens. Now, of those, I cut the number down to 120, not looking at any of the anchors that weren't specifically from Area 2. She included some specimens from, say, Bambula or elsewhere in the city quarter. And then I cut out from my analysis any type of anchors that were small and fragmentary, like you see there at the bottom right with a C, because they don't tell us a lot of important or useful information. And also, when I ran statistics, just general statistics, including them and not including them, it didn't skew the quantities and the percentages at all. And so the total number of anchors I look at were a catalog of 99. Now, I wanted to do some of my calculations incorporating weight. And unfortunately, these anchors were published very well with their drawings, and some of their measurements were included, but only, I think if I remember correctly, six or seven were given weight estimates. Now, obviously, it's really hard to weigh some of these specimens. They're giant, as we're going to see. So I wanted to weigh them if I could myself now. Couldn't get my hands on them at this point. That's a future avenue of research. So what I did instead is I digitally calculated the surface area by looking at the top width, bottom width, length, thickness of these artifacts. And then from the surface area, calculated volume and then mass using a general standardized term of 2,000 kilograms per cubic meter, which is sort of an average for the volume of stone, or sorry, the density of stone. Although it does range. So, you could hone in and do this a little bit more specific, but for this work, this was enough. And so I was able to estimate weights for all of the anchors that I looked at, all 99 of them. And those weights I put into a stem and leaf plot, which you see here. And this sort of gave me statistically two different clusters of weight categories. The top cluster you see there and the bottom. Now, just really quickly, if you're looking at this and you're very confused, the way you read this is you take the stem and you combine it with one of the leaves included there, and that gives you the weight. So this is basically all 99 weights. For example, if I look at stem 1 and then I look at 29, that's 129. That's what that tells us. And we can see there's actually two anchors that weighed 129 kilograms. Or let's go down, 6 and 21, that's 621 kilograms. So statistically, my anchors clustered into two groups, anchors ranging from 7 kilograms to 273 kilograms, and then anchors ranging from 317 kilograms to almost 1,000 kilograms or a ton. Now, obviously, the anchors in my first group, what I classify as small to medium, they have a whole range, and some of those are really honking. But for the statistics that I ran, I wanted to sort of focus on that. And then the really, really, really big outliers, my medium to large group, those 300 up to about 1,000 kilograms. And then I conducted statistical and spatial analyses using GIS and other statistical methodologies. I'm not going to go into detail here because I'll talk about that more later. But what I wanted to highlight is I really hone in on the placement position of these objects, looking specifically at that right category you see there on my table. Basically, anchors I term visible or potentially ritual in nature. So anchors that could always be seen when they were placed, primarily and were connected to something ritual in nature, potentially an altar, an offering table, or maybe a threshold. Now, of course, all the other anchors, those built into benches, column bases, they may have a ritual purpose, but for the sake of this research, I needed to kind of narrow down and focus on this specific category list. And then the way that I did my GIS, I mean, I needed to digitize floor plans and then put the anchors on top of that. And I also wanted to include the coastline that I showed you guys earlier in this presentation. And a brief example of how I did this, I would look where I could actually see anchors on the floor plans and then match those up with the catalog data. For example, these ones here. Sometimes the anchors weren't included in the floor plan, unfortunately, and so I had to do a bit of sleuthing. I was looking at the plates. You can see here this yellow stack of anchors. We're going to talk about it a lot. You can see that in the plate there. And then I could kind of guesstimate where the other three anchors discussed in the catalog would be placed. And sometimes I couldn't find them on a plate or in a floor plan, and so I did my best guess. And this is the overview of the anchors, all 99 that I looked at, where they are located within each structure in Kition Area II. All right, let's see what I actually found. I hope this isn't feeling like the length that it's at. Now, I hope this is engaging. I hope you guys are enjoying this. So, most of the anchors that we have come from the 12th century. Quite interesting. This is, as you might remember, when Kition was reconstructed and a lot of new buildings were built. So we have 61 of our 99 anchors coming from the floors 3A and 3 or the 12th century. And you can see here the distribution of all of the anchors according to their floors. The red ones are those 12th century floor level anchors scattered around different structures. Now, if we're looking at anchor placement, I wanted to look, as I mentioned, at anchors that were in visible or ritual placement positions. And then I added one sort of additional category, and that was anchors in really large clusters. And anchors in really large clusters are those found within walls. So what I determined was we don't actually have any anchors in the 13th century. So that first 100 years of use when we only had two main buildings at Kition in built placement positions. They weren't placed in walls and they weren't placed in visibly, potentially ritual placements. We find large clusters of anchors first occurring in walls in the 12th century, as well as the first evidence of built rituality of anchors. Now let's kind of break this down really quickly, where we find them and the major clusters in each structure. So within Temple 4, we see 18 anchors built into the walls of the structure when it was first built. In Temple 2, we have 7 anchors which are being used within thresholds of the structure. We have altar and offering connected anchors both in Temple 2 and in Temple 5. And then libation installation anchors, we have 3 coming from Temple 4. These are the yellow ones. And then one example coming from Temenos A slash Room 16. They're sort of included together in this open air sacred space. And this is all for the 12th century. When I say libation installation, this is what I'm talking about. These stacked large anchors. Basically, they could have been used for the repetitive offering of food, liquid, what have you. And then in the 12th century, we have 2 freestanding anchors with no structural utility occurring not in one of the monumental buildings, but instead in room 12 of the Northern Workshops. Now, when we jump into the 11th century, we don't see any really large groups of anchors occurring like the wall anchors we saw before. But we do have a few additional ritually utilitarian type of anchors occurring in the 11th century. So we have more freestanding specimens being added to room 12, as well as occurring in Temple 5 and one in Temenos A. We have an anchor connected to an altar also in Temple 5. And then the only example of an anchor built into a threshold that doesn't occur in Temple 2, or actually come from the 12th century, is this 11th century specimen in Temenos A. And then we have another anchor being used as part of a libation installation in the same temenos. It's stacked on top of that earlier libation installation anchor I mentioned. And then when we get to the 10th century, we don't really have any anchors being used in visible or ritually significant positions at all, with a couple caveats. So in Temple 5, there is this really interesting anchor published by Honor Frost as a Mazeboth. I recorded as a Mazeboth because it's a little bit of an outlier in terms of understanding its chronology, but a Mazeboth is basically a beidel, a freestanding anchor being used for ritual purposes. Honor Frost publishes this in her catalog as coming from floor 1, so about the 10th century. Cariorgus and Demas say this anchor comes from between floor layers 2 and 1, so putting it a little bit earlier than Frost publication. And both authors, Carragher, Demas, and Frost, say that it is associated with bucrania, so bull skulls, that come from floor 2, so the 11th century. And so based on the fact we don't actually have any other visible ritually significant anchors being added to Kition in the 10th century, and the association of this anchor with slightly earlier 11th century material, I would argue that this actually should be dated slightly earlier. Now, if we're looking at the weights that I mentioned, we have some interesting potential for comparison with the Eastern Mediterranean assemblage. And we'll talk about that briefly at the end. What I just want to highlight, as I've mentioned, we have a small cluster of outlying, very, very large, medium to large, as I classify them, anchors, those over 300 kilograms. And most of those anchors cluster in Temple 4 are actually built into walls and or used as libation installations, like that big specimen I showed you earlier. And almost all of them come from the 12th century. Here we have them scattered around. Again, the sort of reddish pink ones are the 12th century examples. Now, I wanted to dive in more than just, okay, how are they used, but how long were they used? Because this actually can tell us a lot more about the type of ritual practices that were being done with these anchors. Again, we're going to go building by building. In Temple 4, during the 12th century, we have that libation installation that I've talked about quite a bit. It's a very visible example of maritime rituality in the structure. We also have those clusters of anchors highlighted in sort of reddish pink built into walls. But when we get to the 11th century, any type of visible or ritually associated anchors disappear from this temple. The libation installation is gone. We only have the wall-built anchors remaining because obviously you're not going to destroy your walls to take out anchors. They're built in, they're useful now. In Temple 2, we have anchors being placed in thresholds, so they're visible, potentially connected to ritual, and also associated with an offering table, that lime green specimen you see there. Then we jump again to the 11th century, and the altar's gone, the anchor connected to that is gone, all visible threshold anchors are removed, except for some on the external southern thresholds. And by the 10th century, those anchors are gone as well. Then in Temple 5, we have some anchors connected to an altar again at the start in 12th century. We have some additional specimens being added, freestanding, more connected to an altar in the 11th century, and if my arguments have been persuasive, also that Maesboth anchor there highlighted by our little pink circle with the purple one here. And then in the 10th century, basically all visible or ritually important anchors are gone from this structure, with the potential exception of that Maesboth. But again, as I've said, I don't think it belongs there. But I couldn't find it on the floor plan. This is one of the ones I had to guesstimate. So unfortunately, I'm not actually sure when it went out of use. Then in the 12th century, in the northern workshops, we have freestanding anchors being used as beidels and also smaller offerings. That little green anchor to the right of that red circle, 41, was a smaller, potentially offering anchor connected to a beidel. 11th century, we have some additional freestanding upright anchors being added to the northern workshops, room 12 specifically. And then all visible ritual anchors are gone in the 10th century. So we see sort of a very specific temporal boundary for the use of anchors in a ritual manner occurring in the 12th and 11th centuries and basically disappearing by the 10th centuries. We have kind of one important example that's a bit of an outlier. Beyond that maze moth, I argued probably not from the 10th century. We have an uncertain placement anchor I'm not going to talk about. We can't really understand it well from my research. But we do have two really large anchors being built into the walls of the city, highlighted there in that red circle, in the 10th century. And that's important because that might actually tell us where they came from and then how they ended up there. We'll see that in a sec. Now, anchors with ritual characteristics or potentially ritual characteristics do make up 20% of my assemblage. And if we break that down a little bit, we can see that our marked anchors, so ones with Cyprominoan or possibly Cyprominoan markings, mainly come from the 12th century. Most of the time, actually, are built into walls and cluster in Temple 4 there. Burned anchors, a little bit less clear in terms of their temporality, but mostly they do come from the 12th century. And a lot of them are actually in freestanding positions, with a couple exceptions. And they cluster kind of in the northern workshops and Temple 4, with a few other exceptions. And it's a small group to look at anyway. Cupule anchors are the most diversely spread around this complex. They occur in a lot of different centuries, primarily the 12th as we'd expect, but elsewhere as well. They have different placement positions and different locations, and so this sort of leads me to conclude that having a cupule isn't necessarily the most important element of their ritual function, but instead a cupule in combination with something else, like the way they're placed or a burn or a mark. Broken anchors, they don't give us a lot of patterns. There are 31 of them, but we do see a clustering of broken specimens in Temple 2 in the 12th century, mainly in thresholds, and we're going to come back to that. Anchors I also classify as broken. Some are actually probably cut specifically for placement in walls in Temple 4, and so they're not exactly broken the way we understand it, but for my statistics, I included them. And then I was a little bit disappointed with the spread of composite and weight anchors in Area 2. The only possible patterns I found were composite anchors. Threshold anchors were mainly composite in type, which that is actually interesting, and I'll come back to that. And then if you see a freestanding anchor, most of the time it's weight, and all anchors that are being used for libations are weight. All right, we're hurtling towards my conclusions, I swear. I hope I still have y'all with me. So the fact we have a large amount of anchors at Kition really, I mean, draws us to them. Were they just used haphazardly for building material? Probably not, because as I've mentioned at Halasut and Seke, we do see a cluster of anchors, but they have use where that you would expect for an anchor being used at sea, broken, and then reincorporated into some other structure. We don't see that at Kition. We also shouldn't necessarily conclude that these were leftover material from being near the sea. The fact Kition is placed on the water, so it's sort of being used out of ease. Because in Ugarit, we find, as I've mentioned, a lot of anchors clustered in the Temple of Baal. None of the anchors at Ugarit come from the Temple of Dagon. Dagon was a land deity. Baal was basically a sea deity, storm, but associated with the sea deity. Their temples were next to one another at Ugarit, but anchors only occur in one of them. So there's an intentionality for a maritime specific location. And also, these temples were 2 kilometers away from the water. So you had to actually bring them there. You couldn't just be like, oh, it's near the sea. Let's plop it in the temple. No, there was an intention there. And the same occurs at Byblos, which we see up here. We have the temple, the Tower Temple, and the Temple of the Obelisks. They're kind of up high from the water. So again, the anchors we find in there were placed there with intention. And that's what we see with our main five ritually significant position placements at Kition. Now, the anchors that were built into walls clustered, as I mentioned, mainly in Temple 4 in the 12th century. And a lot of those anchors are actually placed together in four groups. They're aligned, and those grouped anchors also have marks. We also see some marked grouped anchors with burning on the walls at Kition Temple 4, which may be indicative of the fact they were used as a building deposit. Basically, they were placed at the foundation of the construction of this building. They were part of a ritual or something that was occurring as the building was built, or when it was opened. For example, when a mayor cuts a red ribbon at the newest building in your city, you're going to have some sort of ritual occurring. The cupules or the burns and marks on some of these anchors might be leftover indicators of these type of rituals. And I mentioned these anchors earlier in the Tower Temple at Byblos. They were placed as a step in that temple, and their rope holes were covered over by the subsequent step, which means after their placement, no one could actually tell they were anchors. So there was an intentionality of bringing a maritime artifact as a sort of building deposit, which then wouldn't necessarily have been visible after the fact, the same way these wall-built anchors weren't at Kition. We also have a foundation deposit in Kition Temple 4 as well, which gives us sort of another connecting factor to this interpretation. We see a lot of anchors being used in the thresholds, as I've mentioned, and this is an important representative factor of liminality, bringing something that's a maritime type object into a ritual space, as Dr. Yamasaki has talked about a lot in marvelous ways. And the fact that we have broken and composite anchors and also marked anchors and thresholds in Temple 2 might tell us something interesting, which we'll see in a second here. Our freestanding anchors primarily come from one room in the Northern Workshops and Temple 5, and a lot of them are associated with Bucrania. In addition to that Maesboth one I mentioned, some of the anchors in room 12 of the Northern Workshops were connected to burned bull skulls. And a lot of the freestanding anchors have burns as well, which might show they were used as a beidel, these freestanding upright objects connected to ritual practices with bull skulls. And here we have another one. Those were from the Northern Workshops. This is the freestanding anchor in Temple 5. And the Maesboth one I have mentioned a lot. We do have a plate for it, so it's quite cute. And then also we have temple altars connected to anchors, some very specific examples of rituality. Again, that picture from Temple 5. And then those libation installations could have been used for repeated offerings, primarily in Temple 4, but also maybe in Temenose. This is where our libation installation is in this temple. Now, finally, what is the general story we can understand about rituality in these spaces? Well, we see very strong maritime associations in Temple 4. It was placed basically directly south of the sea. The coastline would have been just basically above this floor plan, this temple. And what's interesting is this libation installation of big anchors could have been used by seafarers entering or leaving the city of Kition along Street D, which you see here along this little red line. And basically, this street was the first entry point into the sacred district of Kition Cathari from the water, because we had a big city wall, and you could enter from the land, but if you're coming from the sea, this was the way you would come into the city. You can see here the wall highlighted in pink, and the sea is that blue line over to basically the right of this image, and you would have had to enter this way and in through this street. So basically what I think, if we go back here briefly, is you could have had a seafarer, they could have just come right into the sacred district, or they could have stopped in Temple 4 and left an offering in thanks for basically arriving safely to harbor. Or vice versa, they could have left out of this temple, giving a deposit in anticipation of their voyage and in hope that they would make it. And what is interesting in this interpretation is the same time that libation installation disappears, this courtyard, which you would have been able to enter or exit through Temple 4, is closed off in the 11th century, connecting those two artifacts. And those big anchors I mentioned in the city wall near this temple may have originally actually come from the libation installation. After it went out of use in the 11th century, they could have been left and built into the city wall in the 10th century. And one of those anchors, 18 up there on that image, in my catalog kit T425, is very similar in shape and size to the libation installation anchors you see there. And this is also sort of beneficial for the interpretation of the libation installation. All three anchors would have stood about 0.75 meters high, hip height, easy to place an offering. The fact that we have broken composite anchors and thresholds might indicate that anchors potentially placed as an offering during Temple II's first 100 years of use in the 13th century could have broken over time and then been reincorporated into this structure in a different manner when it was rebuilt. But they still wanted these anchors to be visible, to have a specific maritime connection in this temple. And the composite nature of these anchors and the specific Cypro-Minoan Cypriot markings on them might be their way of showing a Cypriot identity within the visible anchors of the structure for any sort of voyagers or seafarers or travelers who are arriving to Kition as well. And it's interesting that any sort of ritual architecture like an altar disappears at the same time as these composite anchors and thresholds. And then finally, the association of Bucrania with the anchors in Temple 5 and in the northern workshops might connect, as Dr. Webb has said, industry, metallurgical industry with seafaring and maritime artifacts altogether. The wealth of Kition was determined by the export of copper to some extent. And so having Bolskol, which is connected to metallurgy and the copper export industry, we see Bucrania, we see Horn Gods, and Komini connected to copper as well, might bring sort of these three associative spheres together. And what's interesting is the freestanding upright anchors which occur in room 12 of the Northern Workshops, first happened in the 12th century. Then maybe as this industry booms in the 11th century, we have more need of worship. And so in the 11th century, we see additional specimens placed in the Northern Workshops and also occurring freestanding with Bucrania in the 11th century in Temple 5. And then in the 10th century, when the Northern Workshops aren't used anymore, we don't see the same type of Bucrania anchor worship occurring in Temple 5. And finally, I'm almost done, I swear. If we look at the size estimates of the anchors at Kition, we can see some interesting patterns occurring when we compare them with Dr. Votruba's survey of all the material of Bronze Age and Iron Age anchors. Basically, we see anchors at Kition in the 12th century primarily clustering mostly under 250 kilograms with a few outliers all the way up to almost 600 or just above kilograms. And this sort of roughly aligns with the survey of material in the Bronze Age in the second millennium around all of the Eastern Mediterranean. Anchors primarily cluster under 250 kilograms with a few outliers, but not that big. So we basically have a similar type, chronology, size estimate at Kition that matches the Eastern Mediterranean with a few really, really large outliers. Now, if we look at the Iron Age floor levels of Kition, those anchors range but fall at the most under 400 kilograms, whereas anchors throughout the Eastern Mediterranean in the first millennium are much, much smaller. They're 150 kilograms. And so we might understand this as denoting the fact these larger anchors from later floor levels of Kition should actually align more clearly with the second millennium context. So I hope this has been interesting, engaging. Basically, what we see at Kition is a specific type of maritime rituality utilizing anchors in a sacred space, but it only occurs for about 200 years before there's a shift in the type of maritime rituality occurring in the space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaris. That was